And yes, we are recording, and I'll make sure that all of you get a copy of this recording. So we'll wait a few minutes, just 2 minutes, let people join and whatnot. And then I will start with introductions and we'll go from there. So I can introduce myself very briefly. I'm Adam Ortega. I work with Alaska Community Action on Toxics as the communications coordinator. And people are filing in already. Looks like we're up to 30 participants. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Thank you, everybody, for being here to talk about PFAS and states taking the lead to keep us safe. And we're going to start introducing our speakers. But before we do that, I do want to say that CHE Alaska is a program of ACAT. It's also a national chapter as well. It stands for the Collaborative of Health in the Environment, aiming to advance knowledge and effective action towards addressing human and environmental factors to keep everybody safe. So let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to be talking about today. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances are toxic substances used in consumer products, industrial firefighting foams on military bases and airports, and can be found in drinking water in Alaska and throughout the US as well. And here in the Arctic, in Anchorage and around Alaska, firefighting foams that contain PFAS contaminate drinking water of communities in the North Slope to Southeast Alaska. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and introduce our guests. We're joined by Alaska Senator Jesse Kiehl, who sponsored SB 121 last legislative session, which would have established enforceable drinking guidelines for PFAS and other measures to protect Alaska's water. Although it did not pass, Kiehl is drafting a new version of the bill this year. Senator, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Adam.
We're also joined by Sarah Woodbury. Sorry, Senator. Want to make sure we introduce everybody here. Sarah Woodbury from the environmental justice nonprofit Defend Our Health. She is the director of advocacy, and her organization played a vital role in compelling the Maine legislature to pass laws to eliminate PFAS in consumer products. Sarah, thanks for hopping on this call.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
And we are joined by Gretchen Salter, strategic advisor for Safer States, which is an alliance of environmental health in nonprofits organizations. And she helped create a PFAS campaign coalition, bringing together scientists, activists, and advocates to eliminate the use of PFAS. Gretchen, thanks for being here.
Thanks, everyone. Hi.
So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Senator Kiehl. He's going to talk a little bit about what happened last legislative session and the PFAS bill that he put forward.
Well, thanks, Adam. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Really appreciate it. So a little bit of an Alaska legislature-centric talk from me, but I just kind of wanted to run you through sort of why this legislature need to act, why didn't we, and what comes next. And I know that, and then I'll be able to hand off to Sarah and to Gretchen, talk about some models in other states, other places. Others will talk in more detail about what exactly per and polyfluoroalkyl substances are and why they're bad for you. I think the essential thing from a legislative broad strokes public policy standpoint is they're really bad for you. And they're really bad for you in really small amounts. And we have these toxic substances in drinking water in a number of places in Alaska. And it's we haven't tested every place we think we're going to find them. That's coming. That progress has been slowed. It was slowed by a pandemic. It's been slowed by other things. But we don't, I'm confident we don't have the full list of places we've got PFAS. So how do we get it in Alaska? For the most part, airports. And this one comes from Uncle Sam. The FAA has said, if you can land a jet there, you need to have PFAS containing foams capable of putting out jet fuel fires really fast. And they've said for quite some time, you need to test the foam in the equipment. You need to test it where you'd fight a fire. So following all the rules, a lot of airports and airport fire departments, community fire departments at service airports have sprayed this stuff into the environment. And once it's in the drinking water, they call them forever chemicals for a reason. So here we go. It's in groundwater, it's in drinking water. We have a couple other places you find it, including along the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. no great surprise with the quantities of hydrocarbons you move through the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. You need powerful firefighting foams. That's how we got here. Luckily, not too many people get their drinking water from under the pipeline. So that one is contamination. It's in the environment. It's not yet in people. But we have it in a lot more places, right? The Valdez tanker terminal, where the tankers get loaded with Alaska crude, there is a lot of PFAS. It's designed to come down from above. It's designed to bubble up through tanks. It's everywhere. So I introduced a bill, actually the last two legislatures, because Alaska's Department of Environmental Conservation wasn't acting. They were using, frankly, outdated numbers from EPA. They were listing only 2 of the thousands of PFAS substances, and at concentrations much higher than we know is badly harmful to human health. My bill did a couple of things. First and foremost, it listed half a dozen, maybe it was 7 PFAS-containing chemicals or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and listed contaminant levels based on the best science that I could find, and then it did a few other things. It forbade any new spraying in an airport from the moment FAA removed its requirement. Side note: the U.S. Congress gave FAA a hard deadline to do that. It was the top of October 2021. They haven't done that yet. That's a problem. It also had a phase out for when oil companies, whether on the slope or on the pipeline or the tanker terminal, had to phase out, pegged not to a politician, but to when the state fire marshal would certify that there are fluorine-free foams that do the job. Trying to get some of the politics out of that was good, because I'm just going to transition into, there were a couple other things in the bill, but I'm going to transition into how we didn't get such a simple bill passed. A couple of things going on. One of those you'll hear, I think, is an issue in other states. Folks in the PFAS business are concerned about their liability and about the push to regulate heavily their products. You get, frankly, a fair amount of obfuscation. Well, there's PFAS and other stuff. There's PFAS in your waterproof jacket and in certain kinds of dental floss. So we don't even know if the toxicity is from the drinking water. Unfortunately, it's an old story, and it doesn't bear up under much critical thought. Your drinking water, if it is a source of toxic substances, is a problem. You deserve clean drinking water. That's kind of a human thing. Could you get it from somewhere else? Yeah. Do you still deserve clean drinking water? I don't think that's a difficult call. But just to be blunt, we ran into a separation of powers and proper balance of governmental authority between the branches issue. In Alaska, our Department of Environmental Conservation has very, very broad authority to list substances as hazardous. They don't have to come to the legislature for that. And the legislature has a long history of deferring to them. The department did not care for the idea of the Alaska state legislature, a bunch of politicians, passing a law that told them what the list was and what the concentrations were. Of course, my bill set the most permissive level and said the department had the authority to get more restrictive on how much PFAS you could drink if the science supported it. But that was a real bone of contention with the department and with some folks, a few folks in the legislature. We faced another really weird issue, and that was disbelief. Parts per trillion. Don't we usually talk about things as parts per million or even billion? Parts per trillion? Really? And the answer is yes, really. But we had some folks who struggled with that as a concept, that something could be harmful to human health in such low concentrations. Built a remarkably broad group of supporters for the bill. And that's simply because there are so many places in our state where people have this stuff in their drinking water, cut across all kinds of usual ideological lines. But in the end, we weren't able to get that bill passed. So we have a new legislature beginning. So the question is, now what? And when I think about the what's next question, I will tell you a little bit about what I've spent some of the 7 months between the last legislative session ending and this one beginning doing, other than running for office. I do serve an elected office. It's kind of a necessary thing. I've been working on the Department of Environmental Conservation to do what the scientists there know they need to do. And I say that in part because in 2018, just before a change in administrations in the executive branch, DEC had proposed regulations to tighten down on a half a dozen PFAS chemicals. With the change of governor to the one we have today, that got put on the shelf before it was adopted. I've been working on DEC to do the regulations they should have done 4 years ago and should have tightened up since. And I continue to work on that. And there are some folks who are open to that, and a political process. Elections mean things. This governor got reelected. There's a political process above him or above those folks at the department that I haven't given up on, and I continue to work on. The best outcome would be for the department to do what it has always needed to do. If we can accomplish that, I can write a much shorter bill. If we can accomplish that, my bill comes down to some of those no more spraying provisions, especially for airports, which is the primary source, and as well as that same fire marshal pegged limitation, so that as soon as there's a safe alternative, the oil and gas business needs to transition. We don't really have heavy manufacturing that's got a lot of PFAS involved in Alaska. That hasn't been an issue. But the other thing in my bill, it was in the last one, it'll be in any future bill, is a take back provision. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Alaska, we have a lot of tiny villages. They're not on a road system. You can get a barge to them when the river's flowing in the summertime, but right now it's frozen. So your access is by small plane. I'm not talking about jets. They don't necessarily have PFAS contamination today, but we got them back over the decades with help from some nonprofits. Firefighting carts that you can pull behind a four-wheeler. And you can put out a fire in the village in ways that a bucket brigade never could. Guess what there's a container of on those carts? Yeah, fluorinated foam, which is great if there's a problem at the tank farm, except now it's in the environment. And so one of the provisions in my bill requires the state of Alaska to take back up to 25 gallons of that foam, which is more than those villages have. But you can imagine a village of 200, 500, 800 people cannot afford to send even a 5-gallon container of fluorinated foam to the hazmat landfill down in the lower 48 with all the associated shipping charges and a piece of hazmat liability forever and ever if that liner on that landfill ever fails. They can't do it. We need to make sure those foams are appropriately, responsibly stored and disposed of when there's a good disposal option. That's something that remains in my bill. And frankly, it's going to be a drop in the bucket. The Department of Transportation, which runs almost every airport in the state, has ballpark 20,000 gallons of this stuff sitting in warehouses. 25 here and 25 there isn't going to cost them much more. So I think maybe rather than go on at great length, I will pause there. If the department won't do what we all know it needs to do, I'll come back with limitations in the law again. That's frankly harder to pass, but it's got to be done. With that, let me hand this over to the other presenters, talk a little bit about what some other states have done and are considering. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, Senator Kiehl, for speaking on that. We really appreciate the work that you're doing. And although it didn't pass last session, we are looking forward to a new version of the bill being drafted. We do have a question. Richard here asked 3 questions. I'm going to first just look at the first one and just go from there. There are over 9,000 PFAS chemicals that have been identified thus far. How did you decide on the 7 to include in the bill?
Yeah. I used what I could find, the best available science I could find. And initially that was driven by a really comprehensive process that the state of Michigan undertook. Since then, I have a real benefit. I have a member of my staff, Kathy Schlingheid, who happens to have a chemistry background, a degree and some laboratory experience. And so I was able to deploy someone who knew what they were looking at to look at the science. And over the years since I first drafted that bill, to be perfectly frank, the research has really only gone one way, toward revealing toxicity of these substances at lower and lower levels. I didn't have enough really solid science in my hip pocket when I introduced the bill as someone who doesn't have a chemistry background or a healthcare background, to say in 2019 in January that these are a class that we need to treat either, as EPA is considering a couple of different subclasses or all as one. I needed something that was rock solid, that I could look a colleague in the eye and say, you're not going to be embarrassed if you vote for this. I had another benefit, which is pretty much all the PFAS you're going to find in the environment in Alaska is firefighting foam. That's really not 9,000 chemicals. It's only a few. So really, there are 3, maybe 4 of those 7 that we're finding in Alaska in any significant quantities. And it's from airport spraying. So those were the key to begin with.
Gotcha. Got you. Well, thank you, Senator, for being here. We really do appreciate you coming on the call and talking about this important issue. Was there anything else that you wanted to say before that you hop off the call?
I just need to give my apologies in advance that I can't stay throughout. I have a Judiciary Committee meeting. It starts in 13 minutes, so I will be leaving a little early. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, you're completely fine. And I think we do have a few other questions as well, but we're going to let these ladies present, and then we'll go ahead and get to some of those other questions that they might be able to answer. With that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Sarah, if you would like to start on your presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And thanks, Senator Kiehl, for all your work up there in Alaska. I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation. I promise not to take up a whole bunch of time, but wanted to just kind of walk through what we have done up here, or not up here, from you guys down here in Maine. So my name is Sarah Woodbury, and I'm the Director of Advocacy for Defend Our Health. Defend Our Health is a Maine-based nonprofit that works to make sure that everyone has equal access to safe food, safe drinking water, healthy homes, and toxic-free, climate-friendly products. And so over the past few years, PFAS has kind of taken up our entire legislative priorities as we have found contamination here in the state of Maine. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about what PFAS is, kind of health impacts, and then shift into what we have done here in Maine to deal with these issues. So the senator has mentioned a little bit of this, but PFAS is a class of fluorinated chemicals. Depending on kind of who you talk to, it's like between 9,000 and 12,000 different PFAS. So there are a lot of them. PFAS are used to make products grease-proof, stain-resistant, water-resistant. So anything that you have or own that has those properties probably has a little bit of PFAS in it. And as the senator mentioned, we find them in everyday products, dental floss, food packaging, makeup, cookware, clothing, all of like I said, anything that has some sort of properties in it that make it resistant to moisture or grease or oil is probably going to have some level of PFAS in it, and it is all around us. And so there are some pretty significant health impacts from PFAS exposure. More than 98% of people have PFAS in their blood. Part of the reason for this is because it is so incredibly mobile and moves around very easily in our environment and in our water. It has a whole host of health issues. It increases risks of certain types of cancer, such as kidney cancer. There are fertility issues, immunosuppression. So it can interfere with like vaccine efficacy, which in the time of COVID is really problematic. Hormone disruption, liver and thyroid issues. There are all sorts of problems that can be associated with exposure to these toxic chemicals. And as I mentioned, they're very persistent, they are very mobile, and as the senator mentioned, they stick around forever, and they're bioaccumulative. So because you're exposed so much, you're just kind of adding to your body burden, depending on what you're using for products or where where you're getting exposed in the environment. And there are soil and water contaminations from a variety of sources, including the AFFF firefighting foam that the senator mentioned. So Maine is in a little bit different situation than Alaska, whereas we have a lot of PFAS contamination across the state. We have several farms across the state that have huge levels of PFAS contamination. We have several residential drinking water wells that are contaminated. And most of the contamination here from the state of Maine is because of what is euphemistically called biosolids or sludge. And this is the stuff that comes out of our wastewater treatment facilities and is used to spread on farmland. It has been a practice that is practiced in all 50 states. It has been practiced for decades, and it was kind of brought about as a way to kind of reuse what comes out of the wastewater treatment plants. It was kind of a beneficial reuse because it was a good thing for farmers because there's a lot of nutrients in the sludge that comes out of the wastewater treatment facilities. But as we learn more about what's in the sludge, we are learning more and more that there are chemicals in this sludge that we are just unaware of, and they are contaminating our farmland across the US. So in Maine in 2016, 2017, we had a farmer named Fred Stone. Through kind of normal course of business of the federal government for doing spot checking in some drinking water wells, they found high levels of PFAS in a well. And that PFAS they looked for the source and realized that it was coming from a farm in Arundel, Maine, where this sludge, and they, in the course of the investigation, found out that the sludge was the source of the contamination. At first, we thought it was a one-off issue, but because of the levels in Fred's farm and like sky-high levels of PFAS in Fred's soil and his water, and the fact that they tried to mitigate for it and were successful for a couple of months, but then the contamination was so bad that the PFAS kind of ended up contaminating. He slaughtered his cows. He put he trucked in like feed from out of state. He did everything right to try to get the PFAS off his farm, but his soil was so contaminated that it didn't matter. And so Fred's 100-year-old dairy farm is now shut down, kaput. Like it is done. They can no longer farm on this farmland. And so because of that instance, the state put together what we call the PFAS task force, brought together all of the departments that could possibly deal with PFAS, our Department of Environmental Protection, our Department of Ag, Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, emergency management. All of those folks came together for a PFAS task force and looked into some recommendation about what we should do. So out of that task force came the information about the sludge spreading across the state. And so so we passed legislation that required the DEP to kind of compile all of the 700 sites where PFAS had been, where the sludge had been spread, to start doing some testing. So in the process of kind of doing that, we found another contaminated farmland in Fairfield called Tozier Farm. The way that Tozier Farm was kind of situated, the sludge from the farmland kind of ran downhill into the surrounding communities and contaminated almost every single one of the residential wells around that farmland. So there are over 200 contaminated wells in Fairfield. We had Fred Stone's farm. And so the state and the legislature decided we needed to do something about this. And so we've passed a LD 1433, which banned PFAS in food packaging. The LD 1600 on here, this is requiring the state to test all of the farmland where sludge had been spread, and testing the soil and testing the water. So they start with the drinking water. If the drinking water is contaminated, then they kind of concentric circle out, test and test and test until they get to a point where there's no PFAS. In the process, we have found several other contaminated farms. We have Songbird Farm in Unity, which had levels on it that were higher than Fred's in terms of contamination. Those farmers ended up having to shut their farm down. They had to move completely off of the farm because of the levels of contamination in their farmland. And they did blood serum testing and found out that they had such high levels of PFAS in their blood that they were on par with people that worked in 3M and DuPont plants. So we're finding those pockets of contamination around the state because of that sludge spreading. So the DEP is still in the that's our Department of Environmental Protection, is still in the process of testing all of those 700 sites. But as we do that testing, we are finding pockets of contamination across the state because of that sludge. We also we passed legislation that made PFAS a hazardous substance, which allowed some of these contaminated sites to access state Superfund dollars. We updated a statute of limitations that allows folks that are impacted by PFAS contamination to sue those responsible parties for it within a certain time frame. Another thing that we did in the process of all this was set an actual maximum contaminant level for PFAS in drinking water for 6 PFAS. There is no federal standard for PFAS in drinking water. There is an advisory level. It is way too high based on what we know about the health impacts of PFAS. So the state of Maine set one at 20 parts per trillion. We banned PFAS in firefighting foam. And then in last year, 2 years ago, about 18 months ago, we passed the first in the world ban on PFAS in products. So Maine was the first state to say, first off, if you make products with PFAS in it, you have to disclose that to the state. The state is going to set up a database so people can go and look before they go shopping and see what they're buying if it has PFAS in it. And on top of that, we banned PFAS in rugs, carpets, and aftermarket stain treatment just outright. And then our DEP has the authority to name other classes of products that they can ban that have PFAS in them. And then by 2030, all non-essential uses of PFAS will be banned in the state. And, you know, that industry and those that use PFAS in their products have to make the argument to the state that it is essential for the health and well-being of the citizens. So it kind of flips the switch on how we regulate PFAS and is putting the onus on the industry to make the argument that this is necessary. And so, you know, they will have the opportunity to do that. But as we go forward, we will start to ban all, you know, the stuff that is not necessary. There are some things that it's in that we can't, you know, we don't have good alternatives for yet, but there are things that we do have good alternatives for. And so kind of that is where we are at. And like I said, it was the first in the world. Other states are following Maine's lead. Gretchen will probably talk a little bit more about that. But, you know, we kind of we're pretty proud of our PFAS work here in the state. And the other thing I will say about our PFAS work is that it has been 100% bipartisan. All of these bills that you see listed on this all passed with either 100% support from everybody in the legislature or 1 or 2 people dropping off. Both sides of the aisle here in the state recognize that this is a problem, particularly for our rural communities, and everybody has really come together to do the right thing here in the state of Maine, and we hope that other states can learn from that. And then last year we banned the source of the contamination was a sludge on the farmland. As of last year, you can no longer spread sludge on farmland, also the first state to do that. We are studying ways to treat landfill leachate for PFAS before it ends up in our wastewater treatment facilities. We put aside $60 million to help our PFAS impacted farmers and well owners with income replacement, farm buybacks, medical monitoring, and we are also getting PFAS out of pesticides. So Maine has really, not to toot our own horn, but led the way in the work that we're doing as PFAS, and hope that other states can follow our lead in getting this toxic chemical out of our everyday products. And while, you know, cleanup and all of that stuff is important, source reduction is really the name of the game at the end of the day. So I will kind of leave it there and turn it over to Gretchen. I did just want to say our Maine Department of Environmental Protection has a ton of really good resources on their website. If you literally just Google Maine DEP PFAS, it will all come up. Our Health and Human Services also has some really good information. So, and as does our Department of Ag. So if folks are interested to see what Maine is doing in any of these kind of areas, there's a ton of resources online from all of our departments. We also have a bunch of bills this session that we're hoping to pass that will continue this work. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Gretchen.
Great. Adam, do you want me just to go, or do you want to answer see if there are any questions for Sarah specifically?
Let's see what we have. We have 3 questions here. One specifically for Maine, it looks like from Jesse, asks, how is Maine sharing the info on which products are or will be okay list by category? Where are the next level of regulations?
So in terms of the disclosure issue, Maine is working with the Interstate Chemical Clearinghouse, or IC2. And that is it's like a regional thing, like all states can kind of buy into IC2 and utilize their information, but it will be a publicly facing database. We're just kind of building it on top of a database that IC2 already has. So that will be something that people can access on their own. In terms of the regulation, I'm going to guess Gretchen might have a little bit to say on that. So I'll hold off on that and then we can come back to that if it hasn't been answered.
Okay, let me just look at the Q&A here. See, we've answered most of them as they came in. So really grateful for that. Lots of good questions here, lots of good conversations. Laura asks, what about all the PFAS in consumer products, which then may be in biosludge? Wouldn't that also be an issue?
Yeah, so consumer products, so biosolids, you can have municipal or industrial. So obviously industrial is coming from industry. Maine, much like Alaska, doesn't have like a big PFAS industry. We have a couple of paper mills. Some of them use it, but for the most part, we don't have manufacturing in our state. So, but when we tested the sludge, there was not a ton of difference between the levels of PFAS in industrial sludge and a municipal sludge, because PFAS is in so many products. So yes, if you wash a jacket that is waterproof and that goes into your wastewater, that will end up in the sludge. All of that, if you're washing dishes and you have a Teflon pan, some of that can wash down the drain. Anything that can kind of go down the drain, yes, will end up in the wastewater treatment facilities, and yes, can end up in the sludge. And unfortunately, there is not a really good option for dealing with sludge. Right now, the state of Maine is landfilling it because it's the best of bad options, because you cannot really destroy PFAS. They don't really have a good way to destroy it. A lot of people talk about incineration. That is a no-go at this point because it does not actually destroy it. So I know that there are studies being done and ways to try to figure out how to destroy it, but right now there's not a good way to do that. And so when we're looking at sludge and that type of stuff, for the moment, we are landfilling it until we can figure out something better.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for that. Really appreciate your work. That's Sarah Woodbury from Defend Our Health. Really great to have you on the call. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Gretchen of Safer States now to talk about the PFAS coalition that her organization and she built.
Great, thanks so much. Let me just get to my slide. Great. Okay. I don't know why this isn't starting. There we go. Okay. Great. So thank you so much, Adam, and everybody for being here today. My name is Gretchen Salter. I'm with Safer States, and Adam wanted me to talk about this broad national PFAS campaign that has been working since 2017, and for a lot of folks, even earlier than that, to eliminate PFAS. So just a quick word about who Safer States is. We are an alliance of diverse environmental health organizations from across the country that are committed to building a healthier world. And what we do is we really harness place-based power, meaning the people in Safer States are state-based groups. They are local groups and working to pass different kinds of policies to protect people from toxic chemicals, as well as just try to spark innovation for a more sustainable world. So the PFAS campaign itself started in 2017 after noticing Safer States has been around for a while working on chemicals policy, and we just noticed this issue of PFAS starting to bubble up, particularly with a lot of environmental justice organizations. There were a lot of local groups that were working on PFAS campaigns and PFAS that had been contaminating their drinking water, and saw that there was really a need for all of the state, national, and local groups to come together and figure out how we are all going to solve this issue collectively. And so in 2017, we started this group, and we now have over 70 organizations from around the country who are working on this PFAS campaign. We have groups, big national groups that have very large presence, to very small local groups that are working on their one drinking water facility or the one point source pollution in their in their community. But for all of us, there are really three main goals of this entire campaign. The first is to turn off the tap. Second is to clean it up. And the third is to make polluters pay. So turning off the tap means getting rid of PFAS wherever we can find it, wherever it's still being used in products or in any sort of processes. Cleaning it up means getting it out of drinking water, which is very difficult, but a lot of folks are doing a lot of great work on that. And then finally, make polluters pay. I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit more. But essentially, make polluters pay. We don't feel that it should be up to those of us who did not cause the problem to pay for its cleanup. We really want to make sure that those who caused this problem are held financially accountable for the damage that they've caused. So where are we on turning off the tap? So really what we mean by this is to stop PFAS production as much as possible. And so Safer States has really been focused on the demand side. So looking at eliminating PFAS from everyday products. So we started really in 2017, 2018, looking at PFAS and firefighting foam and food packaging. Ironically, we really thought food packaging would be the thing that captured everyone's attention, but it was actually firefighting foam, because I think people recognize, as Senator Kiehl said, and as Sarah said, when you have this in your drinking water, it becomes incredibly personal. And this is, and firefighting foam is something that was just being constantly shoved into our drinking water constantly. So the first state that was able to pass legislation on PFAS and firefighting foam was Washington. And a number of states have since followed. We now have 15 states who have banned PFAS in firefighting foam. And there's some movement at the federal level to get it out of firefighting foam, both within Department of Defense and with FAA, but that's a bit slower. We now are moving to much larger categories of consumer products. So looking still at PFAS and firefighting foam and food packaging, but a number of states, including Maine, who has really led the way on a lot of these issues, are looking at much broader categories of consumer products. So last year, Colorado passed a really comprehensive bill that banned PFAS in a number of product categories, including certain kinds of textiles, including ski wax, including kids products, and in some cosmetics. And so this year we anticipate a number of states who are going to kind of combine the Maine approach with the Colorado approach, where it's going to name a number of different consumer products, taking those that were passed in Colorado and adding to them. So looking at all apparel, banning PFAS from all apparel, which was passed in California last year, including that on a large list of consumer products. There are a number of states who are also looking to add artificial turf and menstrual products to the list of products that cannot contain PFAS. And then those states would combine then the Maine approach and saying, these are the product categories that have to be, that cannot have PFAS in them, and then also giving their state agency the authority to add to the number of products that cannot have PFAS in them. So right now we have 104 different PFAS policies that have passed in 23 states at this point. We've also secured a number of retail commitments. We work with a great organization called Mind the Store that puts pressure on retailers to eliminate PFAS from their products. And so the reason we have this sort of push-pull between the states and the market is it is incredibly difficult, as you all probably know, to get anything passed at the federal level. But by having a number of different state-based policies that ban PFAS in a number of consumer products, using that pressure to pressure retailers to eliminate PFAS from their products nationwide is a way that we can try to get national protections without having to step foot in Washington, D.C. And so we've secured commitments from Burger King, from Starbucks, from Taco Bell, from Panera to eliminate PFAS in food packaging. We've also secured commitments from Home Depot and Lowe's to get rid of PFAS in some of their products, as well as Levi's and H&M and some of the outdoor apparel manufacturers like Patagonia to take PFAS out of their products as well. So the combination of the two is one way that we're able to turn off the tap on PFAS. Looking ahead really for this session, we're looking to phase out a number of other products. We have talked about menstrual products and artificial turf. I think really the next horizon is trying to figure out how to get PFAS out of manufacturing. Most of the policies that have passed at this point really only relate to PFAS that has been intentionally added to a product to have an effect. There are a few states who are looking to add any sort of PFAS that's in a product due to a manufacturing process or due to contamination. Rhode Island was able to pass a law last year that included such kind of PFAS contamination from manufacturing. And I think a few other states are going to be trying this year as a way to try to get PFAS out of that manufacturing process, which is a huge source of pollution for most of the country. So cleaning it up. What we mean when we talk about cleaning it up is getting it out of drinking water, getting it out of sludge, finding the right and responsible way to eliminate PFAS from the environment. So the map you see before you here are states that have either currently have enforceable drinking water standards or have guidance level or have enforceable drinking water standards that are pending. Not all of them are created equal, as Sarah and the senator talked about. Some of them are really high, some of them are quite low. It is very challenging at this point to try to get a maximum contamination level or an MCL for the entire class of PFAS, because that's just not the way that water regulations have been written. And so we're having to really work with those water agencies and figure out the right way to find those MCLs for all PFAS and find the right kind of testing to make sure that those laws are being followed. So huge kudos to our friends in Maine and friends in Vermont and other places who are doing that amazing work right now. There are also some states who have surface water regulations. North Carolina is looking at that as well, since they have massive contamination from a plant in their state. And we also have starting to look at incineration bans. So Illinois last year was able to pass a ban on incinerating PFOA and PFOS, two of the long chain forms of PFAS. They're the most well studied. There's the most data on them. I nearly slipped up and called them the worst, but we don't actually know that. We just know that they've been studied really well. And so Illinois was able to ban incineration on PFOA and PFOS. And so we are encouraging states to take that further and ban the incineration of PFAS in general, just because we know that it just does not destroy PFAS the way it needs to. And what happens is that PFAS then becomes airborne and then travels globally, mostly to where you folks live. It all kind of goes into that Arctic sink that you all are dealing with up there. And then finally, as Sarah mentioned, we are encouraging states to adopt different sorts of sludge standards. Again, this is a really tricky issue because, as Sarah said, people are losing their farms. And so any sort of sludge standards needs to be passed in a really thoughtful way that makes sure to compensate farmers and make sure that people aren't losing their livelihood due to forces that are beyond their control. And finally, the last piece that I want to talk about is our Make Them Pay. And so I want to switch over to this website if I can for just a moment. We have this website called nonsticknightmare.org. And this is where we have calculated the costs that states have spent trying to clean up PFAS. These are only documented costs at this point. Can folks see it? See the website? Sarah has her hand raised. Okay. Okay, sorry. So if you scroll on each state, you can see how much a state has spent. So my home state of California right now, we've spent over $168 million trying to clean up PFAS. Looking at Alaska, this is just what we know for sure. I'm sure that Alaska has spent far more than this. Alaska spent over $22 million trying to clean up PFAS. And so what we have developed then is a strategy where we work with state attorneys general. Here, let me go back to my slideshow, where we work with state attorneys general to sue PFAS manufacturers for money to, pay the state back and pay taxpayers back for cleanup. So these are the states right now who are either pursuing litigation or have a settled lawsuit. Minnesota settled a couple of years ago for $850 million. Delaware settled for $50 million. And there's so much more PFAS out there than I think we even recognize. Every time we look for it, we find it. And so working with attorneys general to sue manufacturers for cleanup is another strategy that we highly recommend employing. So I'll stop there and just talk about a couple of the resources that we have. So Safer States has a website. We also have a bill tracker that you can look and see what states are introducing what legislation and kind of track those bills that way. The website that I just showed you is on nonsticknightmare.org. You can look up your state and you can look up all of the different costs, and it details those costs out as well. There's a great organization called the Association of State Drinking Water Associations. That's not quite right, but it's drinking water agencies is what I meant to say. They have a lot of great information on PFAS and drinking water regulations. And then finally, the retailer campaign that I mentioned, mindthestore.org, has a lot of great information there as well on PFAS policies that have passed at retailers. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you, Gretchen, for your work.
Adam, can I
Yeah.
mention something really quick?
Of
Sorry,
course.
Gretchen made me think of something in her discussion. When we talk about PFAS, we're talking about PFAS as a class. And if you're looking at regulating PFAS, we've talked about MCLs in drinking water for 6 different PFAS or 8 different PFAS or whatever. What we would like to try to do is regulate the whole thing. So you're not playing whack-a-mole, so that, because what industry does is we say this one PFAS is bad. And so they create another one and they're like, this one's fine. So when Maine wrote all of its legislation, except for the drinking water thing, because as Gretchen said, that's hard to do as a class, we regulate PFAS as a class. If you're looking at like what the federal government does, they're taking a little bit more of a whack-a-mole approach, much to the disgust of the people that do the work in the states. And so when you're looking at trying to regulate PFAS if you're in different states, like be very, kind of careful about what you're doing in terms of how you're defining it, all of that good stuff, to make sure that your state doesn't continue to have to play whack-a-mole as you're regulating like 2 PFAS or 6 PFAS. Like I said, drinking water is a little bit of a different situation, but when you're looking at regulating consumer products, that is what Maine did. We have a very simple definition for PFAS that encompasses, almost all of them, if not all of them, by the way that we define it. And so we want to make sure that we're regulating that as a class. And then the other thing I forgot to mention in the terms of, when I was talking about the sludge, I think I forgot to finish my thought there. Municipal sludge and industrial sludge we're testing at the same levels. So industrial is not necessarily worse. They're both very, very bad. And it has destroyed several farms in the state of Maine. Tozier Farm shut down, Songbird Farm shut down, Fredstone Farm shut down. So this is nasty stuff that we need to make sure we're getting out of our products.
Mm-hmm. The other resource that I should have mentioned as well is that Safer States every year produces model legislation and a PFAS toolkit that has a lot of great information, good scientific information, fact sheets, articles, you name it, anything you could possibly need on PFAS we have. I don't have a link that I can share with you right now, but I can send it to Adam and he can go ahead and make sure that you all get it.
Yep, we will definitely make sure that all the attendees have the toolkit to look at what model legislation for PFAS regulation looks like. We also do want to say that ACAT, Alaska Community Action on Toxic, is also a member of Safer States. Fighting the good fight, trying to regulate PFAS within our home state as well. I have a question from Sarah here, and I think we kind of talked about it a little bit. How do we ensure that chemicals replacing PFAS in consumer products are not just as harmful or more harmful than the legacy PFAS?
Yeah. I mean, that is the $10 million question. Probably it's actually probably worth more than that. When California passed their bills, they included a provision that said, you cannot replace PFAS with anything that is, that is as toxic or more toxic than PFAS. That's, sort of a throwaway line because we really don't have anything better. Really, it takes a massive overhaul of our chemicals policy system. And so a number of states have some, comprehensive chemicals policy, including Maine, including California, including Washington, where the state looks at chemicals of concern and they identify alternatives and then they regulate a chemical based on those alternatives. But it's a very slow way to do something. And particularly if you're talking about PFAS and trying to regulate as a class, that gets a little sticky as well. So it is a massive problem in our chemical regulatory system that chemicals don't have to be proven to be safe before they actually hit the market. And until we have that, I think we're going to have to try to find these different workarounds, which is what, we've sort of done. Sarah, anything more to add to that?
Nope, just echoing we need to overhaul our chemical process at the federal level. So,
and just to say, we did that in 2016. There was an overhaul to the Toxic Substances Control Act However, it's still, it doesn't give authority to regulate chemicals as a class, and it is a very slow and painful whack-a-mole process, and it does not include the provisions that we just talked about. So yeah, there's more needs to be done.
Yeah, and I just want to echo that sentiment as well. That's something that we talk about within our organization too, is this precautionary rule. For toxics, they should be considered guilty until proven innocent. Not the other way around. We're going to answer another question from Dylan here. He says, "Thank you for both of your work. And how, in your views, can we include systemic solutions to PFAS pollution in fighting the, albeit valuable, PFAS regulating legislation? How can we also challenge the root social, economic, and political structures that prioritize profit and financial growth?" That's quite the question, Dylan. Thank you for that.
Sarah?
I was waiting for you to take it. And I was like, do we need, I don't know, get rid of capitalism? I'm not sure. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think, just in the most simplistic terms, and this is not, this is not truly answering your question, because I'm not sure I have a good answer to your question, but I just think we need to continue to educate people about the impacts of this. And we found, because I live in Maine and this is my experience, as we tell these stories of these impacted communities, as we talk about the impacts on our farmers, and in Maine, there's also impacts on the tribal communities here, particularly from landfill leachate that is ending up in the Penobscot River, which impacts the Penobscot Nation here in Maine. But as you start to tell those personal stories, people really understand that, and we have really good, legislators that are doing the right thing. So I think it kind of goes back to that, organizing and policy principle of the personal is political. And you need to, if you can get those personal stories in front of people, it actually makes them start to think. And now that's not going to deal with your DuPonts and your Kimors who have to, deal with their boards and whatnot. But I think the more that we can show the personal impact on actual people, then that actually does, might be slow, but it does change people's mind. But the other problem is capitalism. So.
Well, and I think what it does is it shows the need for a lot more intersectional organizing than any of the progressive campaigns have done in the past. And so I think one of the challenges that we've had over the last, few decades is that you have your environmental bucket here, and then within that, there's the climate silo, there's the toxic silo, there's the animal conservation silo, and they kind of talk to each other, but not a whole lot. And over here, you have the socioeconomic bucket that needs to happen. And over here you have the racial justice bucket. And what needs to happen is we all need to be talking with each other, because these are all the same societal ills that come from a system that is no longer working for us. And so I don't purport to know exactly what the policies need to be, but I think what it does is it begs for much larger solutions, and for us to be working not just within the environmental community and not just within, the toxics community, but really across the progressive lens to figure out what are the systemic what are the root systemic causes of all this, and what are the actual solutions that are going to be necessary moving forward, and understand that those root causes are not going to be addressed with a simple 5 to 10 year campaign. That is going to be the work of a lifetime or a couple of lifetimes, but we need to start that work now.
And also making sure that the people that are most impacted are the ones that are leading those campaigns. The environmental movement is very traditionally white. That we need to do a much better job of engaging those actual impact and listening to those impacted communities, and talking about, because for them, it's not just the pollution, it's the socioeconomic part of it, it's the housing part of it. There's all of this stuff that goes into it. And so, like Gretchen said, get more intersectional, but actually start, letting those communities that are impacted lead those charges, and not feel like we can come in and be like, okay, PFAS is the problem, this is what you should do. That is not we need to, be in listening mode and learn from those communities that are actually dealing with the impacts.
Absolutely. Really well put, Sarah. I'm gonna get one more question from the Q&A little section here. Retailers are committed to this is Richard, by the way. Retailers are committed to keeping PFAS out of their products, which is great. Do these commitments mean products that the company manufactures themselves, or products that are manufactured with PFAS chemicals then sold through the retailer. I.e., a retailer could commit not to manufacturing goods with PFAS chemicals, but then import and sell products that contain it.
Yeah. It's a good question, and it depends on the manufacturer and it depends on the commitment. Some have really just committed to looking at their own their own in-store brands, and others are requiring it of the entire spectrum. So the Mind the Store website would have a lot more information on that, but you're absolutely right. And so where we keep pushing is not just on in-store brands, but trying to have those retailers make a policy that says we will not sell anything in the store that contains PFAS or any of the other, hundreds of problematic chemicals that we could name.
And the Maine law has some language in it around labeling. So like, if you put your name on it, you need to disclose. So like Walmart has like a private label brand, Hannaford's, all those folks, like they have to be the ones that, they've got their name on it. They need to disclose that information. They need to deal with that. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I believe that is all the questions that we had come in. Quite a few. Thank you for answering those. I know those can be a little tricky to answer on the fly like that. Before we get out of here, was there any closing comments that you guys wanted to relay to everyone here?
I mean, really just thank you all for being so engaged, and thank you so much, ACAT, for hosting this. I just always so appreciate the work that you all are doing in Alaska, and recognizing that you have a much tougher political environment than maybe some others do, but really do appreciate the fact that you are still pushing on this and getting done what you can get done in Alaska. So thank you so much for your work. And Senator Kiehl is gone, but thank you to him for leading the charge on so much of this work.
And thank you, Gretchen.
Yeah, and I would just echo Gretchen's comments. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this. Thank you for everybody that joined tonight and spent an hour of their day talking about PFAS or learning about PFAS. And thanks to you, Adam, and your organization, and thanks to the senator. We're going to continue to work on this here in Maine. And if there are other folks that want to learn more about that, like, we're always happy to chat. So.
Awesome. And I'll go ahead and make sure that all the attendees that saw this will make sure to have it on demand as well on our website. As well as the legislation toolkit from Safer States and some of additional resources as well. I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great evening. This has been a production of Che Alaska and Alaska Community Action on Toxics. Until next time, Gretchen, Sarah, we'll talk to you soon, okay?
Bye, thanks.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.